Welcome to January's Lunch and Learn. My name is Karl Teichman. I'm Director of Government and Community Relations with Illinois Wesleyan, and the university, along with the museum, are the sponsors for this Lunch and Learn series. Today, we, I think, have a very interesting topic to discuss. Actually, I'll be joined by one of my colleagues, Ellen Furlong, who is the Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of the IWU Dog Scientists Team. Ellen will be talking about what does Fido know inside the mind of the dog. And so, Ellen, thanks so much for joining us today. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Karl. Thank you all for joining us today. Talking about dogs is one of my absolute favorite things to do, so I'm always very excited to get the opportunity to share some of the work that we've been doing or some of the current work in learning more about dogs and how dogs think and make decisions. I think that, well, I'll just do a little quick introduction as well. I became interested in studying animals back when I was a teenager. I had two dogs, a Cocker Spaniel and a Terrier mix, and I became fascinated by why the Cocker Spaniel would do anything I asked her to do, and do so with such enthusiasm and delight. And why the Terrier was so stubborn, why she didn't want to do the things that I wanted her to do. That really sort of sparked my interest in studying animal minds. I got, from there, I sort of went a strange direction. I started working with primates. So I've done a lot of work with chimpanzees mostly, also some work with orangutans and capuchin monkeys and rhesus macaques, and recently I've done a little bit of work with the monkeys that live in Gibraltar. If any of you have made it out to Gibraltar, there's about 200 monkeys that live there, and my students and I have gone out and done some work with them. So I have a sort of a primate side and a dog side to me. I came back to dogs when I was a postdoc at Yale University back in 2011. I convinced my advisor that dogs would be a really good group of animals to study because they are cheap. Dogs will work for kibble and treats, and they do so with enthusiasm. And they're a lot safer than working with chimpanzees. I always joke that, I have all of my fingers and they're all in the same place as they were when I was born. And that's my greatest accomplishment as somebody who worked with chimpanzees. Working with dogs is a lot safer. So, but dogs are also really fascinating creatures in and of, for their own sake. And so what I thought I'd do today is sort of give you some of my favorite dog facts, I guess. Some of the things that people often ask me about, or the things that kind of blow people's mind when I talk to them about dogs. I will do a little plug here. All of these are things that come out of my Great Courses audiobook. It's called Decoding Dogs, and it's available on Audible. So if you are excited about this kind of thing and you want to know more, that's a good place to check out for more dog info, but I can also direct you to other books and resources as well if you have other questions. So I thought that I would sort of give you some of these fun facts about dogs and then open things up to questions after a little bit. The sort of first thing that I wanted to talk about dogs is that a lot of times people don't really understand the history of dogs. And so they think, I don't know exactly where people think dogs came from, but a lot of times people have some misconceptions, or they think they know how dogs domesticated, but they don't really. So I'm just gonna sort of run through what we do and what we don't know about how dogs became dogs. And this is going to be a little bit frustrating because we don't know almost as much as we do know. So I'll be sure and tell you where there are questions and where we are pretty sure about some things and places where we have questions. But one thing that we're pretty sure of is that dogs were the first domesticated animals. And this is kind of crazy if you think about it, because dogs are like their earliest relative is the gray wolf. So they're most like the gray wolf as we know it today. So their ancestors probably looked something like that, like a big predator with some big teeth and kind of scary. And so how we became to be such good buddies with a big, giant, scary predator is kind of a fascinating question. It leads to a bunch of other questions like, why did dogs domesticate? Where did they domesticate? When did they domesticate? I'm not really going to be able to answer any of these questions, but I can narrow some things down for you a little bit. We know that humans and wolves knew about each other and lived together in the same space we've been around each other for about 100,000 years. So we've been together for a really long time, even before domestication happened. And there are two sort of the most supported stories about dog domestication. So there's two of them. I'm going to first talk about the sort of late story. So there's a late story and an early story. The late story is probably the one that you've heard. If you've heard a story about dog domestication, it's probably the one that you've heard. And this is the idea that dogs domesticated somewhere between 12 to 10,000 years ago, somewhere around then. The idea here is that what changed to make these wolves that were hanging out around humans all of a sudden start changing and morphing into dogs is that humans developed settlements. And so instead of being sort of nomadic and moving around and having this hunter-gatherer lifestyle, now all of a sudden humans are sort of congregating in groups, living together in those groups for long periods of time. And that means that humans have trash piles. And so the idea here is that wolves started to sort of morph, or at least some wolves started to morph into dogs, started to domesticate about the same time that human settlements happened, because they started to scavenge on the food scraps that humans would throw away into our trash piles. And this was good for the dogs because they got to eat more food. They didn't have to hunt as much. They didn't have to risk getting injured in a hunt. They could just eat the scraps that humans had left behind. And it was also good for humans because the dogs, the wolves, the dogs, wherever sort of they became dogs to wolves, or wolves to dogs, would sort of act as a little bit of an alarm system. They would bark, they would make noise, they would alert to intruders. So we know that according to this late story, we've got sort of benefits for both. Dogs are benefiting with all this extra snacks, and humans are benefiting because the dogs are cleaning up their messes, but also because they're acting as alarm systems. We have clear evidence of humans and dogs interacting together in ways that are really friendly about 12,000 years ago. So there was a Natufian site, which is a group of people in Israel, where there was a woman who was buried with a puppy, and she was buried, she seemed to have her arm wrapped around the puppy. And so it looked like a very sort of loving kind of gesture. Shortly after this, we start to see evidence of humans and dogs doing stuff together in art and cave paintings and various other kinds of forms of remains that are left in the archaeological record. So eventually, down the road, dogs started to diversify into different kinds of creatures. Like we see today, hundreds of different kinds of breeds. By Roman times, we had about 5 different breeds. There were lap dogs at Roman times. There were dogs for hunting, dogs for herding, dogs for protection. Dogs started to diversify fairly early, and diversification has just sort of dramatically increased over the last several hundred years. Even just in the last 20 years, we get all these doodles, right? We still see dogs, new dog breeds, new shapes and kinds of dogs popping up all over the place. So that's the late story. So we know that for sure by about, 10 to 12,000 years ago, humans and dogs were buddies. But there's also an early story that is supported by some DNA evidence and a little bit by some archaeological evidence as well, which suggests that dogs domesticated long before that. We're talking like 30 to 40,000 years ago. We can see some evidence for this in some early dog remains that were found in the Altai Mountains in Russia, the Goyer dog, which was suddenly left my head. I think it's France. These were skeletal remains that were found that look more dog-like than wolf-like. The way that researchers can tell a dog from a wolf skeleton is it's a little iffy sometimes, but usually they're looking at the jaw and at the teeth. And so these two specimens, found many miles apart from each other, but dating back to about the same time, had more dog-like than wolf-like jaws and teeth. But there's a lot of debate about these two dogs. Maybe they're another species of canine that was around at the time. We know there are lots of canid species. There's dogs, there's wolves, there's jackals. In my neighborhood right now, we have a fox that comes out every night and drives my dogs insane. They bark at him through the window and it's like the highlight of their day. So foxes, lots of canid species. So who's to say that these two dogs were not some canid species that went extinct, right? Some former species. Or maybe they were a failed attempt at domestication. Maybe they were, the early attempts at domestication that just died out and didn't survive in the long run. There is some good evidence that the dogs and humans tried to become friends at several times throughout history, but it really didn't take. And the question is, when did it really finally take? Looking at the DNA evidence, however, sort of does put dog domestication back pretty far. It puts it back somewhere around this time period. So even though there's argument about these two specimens, some of the genetic evidence really does seem to suggest that probably at least some good chunk of the way, probably dogs were at least some good chunk of the way towards becoming the dogs that we know early on. But the question then is, why? Why did they suddenly domesticate? Human behavior hadn't changed. We were still hunting and gathering 40,000 years ago. We didn't have settlements for dogs to scavenge around. Why would they do this? Well, some researchers are suggesting that what happened is that dogs and humans were really competing, or I guess wolves at the time, and humans were really competing for access to the same thing. We were both hunting things like deer, and sometimes we would get to a site of a wolf kill and chase the wolves off. Sometimes they would get to a site where humans had killed a deer and chase us off. So we were interacting already. What might have happened is that humans discovered that wolves were really good at tracking and would follow the wolves along as they're going on their kills. And wolves may have discovered that humans are good for scavenging off of. So it could have been a sort of a gradual process where we sort of figured out each other's benefits because we were sort of hunting the same thing. We were inhabiting the same space. But why don't we know, right? Why don't we know the answer to this question of, was it 10,000 years ago that they evolved, or was it 40,000 years ago, or was it something else entirely? there's a lot of reasons why this is really hard. And I think that this is one of the fascinating parts of understanding dog domestication, is really understanding just how complicated it is to try and piece together. So it's really hard. And the reasons, here are several reasons why it's hard. I'll just give you a few. One is, at what point do you say that a specimen in the fossil record is a dog and not a wolf? Now, I mentioned that people are using jaws and teeth as a way of determining that a specimen is a dog and not a wolf. But how, basically they're looking at how short the snout is, and that shortening of the snout means the teeth are more crowded and the jaws are shorter. But how short does the snout need to be in order to say that it's a dog and not a wolf? I sort of liken this to, I like to bake. So I liken this to baking a cake. When you are making a cake, you make the batter and then you put it in the oven, and half an hour later you pull it out of the oven and you've got a cake. Well, what happens like 15 minutes in? Do you have batter in the oven or do you have cake? And so what we might be talking about in this area between 40,000 years ago and 10,000 years ago is sort of that same question. Is it batter or is it cake? Is it a wolf or is it a dog? And so it can be really hard to know the exact moment that transfer happened, that change occurred. We also know that there are really small samples. There aren't a ton of ancient dog remains out there or ancient wolf remains for us to look at and determine what it is. This is we're talking about a long time ago, 40,000 years ago. And so there's a handful of specimens, but there's really not enough to help us really know for sure if it's a dog, if it's a wolf, we just need kind of more evidence here, and only unsurfacing more remains can help us do that. But I think the thing that's the most interesting about why it's so hard to know if a specimen is a dog or a wolf is that it's entirely possible that the behavior of the animals changed before the bones did. And we know that behavior itself doesn't fossilize, okay? So it could be that there were dogs that were hanging out near-ish humans and were kind of collaborating with humans and kind of working in close association with us, but that their behavior might not have fossilized. And so that makes it really hard to look back in the fossil record and know whether they were behaving like dogs or behaving like wolves. We know, for example, that animal behavior can change without changes in their bone structure. So there's a really famous study done with foxes in Russia, where the researchers selected sort of tame foxes and bred those, and then selected sort of more wild type foxes and bred those together. And what they found is that over just like 50 years, the tame foxes became more domesticated like. They started to look more like domestic dogs. Their coats started to change color, their ears became floppier, they started to wag their tails. But all of that is stuff that doesn't fossilize. Ear cartilage doesn't fossilize, the color of their coat doesn't fossilize very well. So it could be that we were getting those kinds of changes early on, but they weren't reflected in the fossil record until later. So this idea kind of supports that DNA account of an early story, that sort of 40,000 years ago story, but it's still up in the air. It's still a constant debate. I was at a conference a couple years ago in which they were debating this very question, and all the researchers who were doing dog DNA stuff were in there, and they were fighting so hard about when and where and how many domestication events were there and all of this stuff, that it is a really active discussion, There are disagreements among the researchers who are doing this work. And I think this is a beautiful case of where researchers who have very different beliefs and very different ideas about how the domestication events happened have really learned to work together. So there's a big push. They're all working together now on trying to sort of combine their evidence, their expertise, and try and all together work to see if they can come up with an answer to this question. So what that means is maybe in the next, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, maybe we'll have a better picture. But I always like to sort of bring people into the controversy when I can. I think that seeing the messiness of research and seeing how people sort of weigh different pieces of evidence and think about how our knowledge is generated can be a really exciting place to be. Can be frustrating because you don't know the answer, but it can also be really exciting to see that sort of the way that each piece of evidence can sort of shift the way that we think. So, so what do we know? Well, we know that dogs' closest relatives are the gray wolves. They are sort of evolutionary cousins of sorts. So it's not that dogs descended from gray wolves, it's that dogs and gray wolves both have the same great, 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 many times great grandmother. So they're pretty closely related, but they're not descendants. We know that dogs probably domesticated somewhere between 12 and 35,000 years ago, something like that. It's a big window, but we're working on narrowing it down. And we know that there was at least one domestication attempt. We know that was successful. We know that because, well, there are 2 dogs at my feet right now, so they exist. But there's argument about how many there were. Some people say 1, some people say 3, some people say 7. But there's good evidence in Asia, Europe, and the Near East of sort of early domesticated dogs. And it could be that there are 3 different domestication lineages that we have 3 or 5 or 7 that we have right now. So kind of frustrating to not know the answer, but I think it's really cool to sort of see how the science works. So that was my first point here about how dogs got to be dogs. And so through evolution, through domestication for thousands of years, we know that dogs have now turned into these creatures that we know and love so much. But just like their domestication history is a bit of a mystery, that's not the end of the mystery. The way that dogs even just perceive the world around them is so different than the way that you and I do. That it's really profound and really fascinating to think about. So I want to talk now about dog perception and the way that that dogs see, hear, and smell the world around them. I'm going to start with the sort of do a quick overview of vision and hearing, but then I'm really going to talk about smell because dogs are just outstanding when it comes to smell. Dogs' vision is similar-ish to humans, but they generally have worse vision than we do. They can't see as far as we do. So if you can see the end of a city block, they can see about 1/3 of the way down. So they're not seeing nearly as far as we do. They can see movement better than still things. So, you know, earlier today I took my dogs for a walk, and one of my dogs spotted a squirrel, you know, halfway down the block, and he got real excited, but it was moving, right? So moving objects they can see further away than close-up objects. Every creature has 2 kinds of receptors in their eyes, rods, which allow you to sense light and dark, and cones, which allow you to sense color. Dogs have more rods than we do. So basically that allows them to see better at dusk and dawn, which is, you know, when wolves typically are hunting. So they kind of inherited that from their wolfy ancestry. And a lot of people tend to think that dogs are colorblind, and they kind of are, they kind of aren't. So people assume that dogs can't see any colors at all. But in fact, they are just red-green colorblind, like many people are. What this means is that we have 3 different kinds of cones, and there's one kind of cone that allows us to see red and green, and they just don't have that cone. They can see blues and yellows really well. Those are the ones that they can see the best. But reds and greens are really hard. So dogs have 2 kinds of cones to our 3, but we shouldn't get too smug about this because we certainly don't have the most cones of any creature. The mantis shrimp, which is a fearsome little shrimp that lives in the ocean, has 14 cones. So they see colors that we can't even imagine. So don't feel too bad about your dog not being able to see color, because they can see color, just not the same array that we can. Yeah, so color vision. Related to vision, a lot of times I get a question about whether dogs can see TV. The answer used to be no. Just like, you know how sometimes you're watching a TV or a movie and the people in the show are watching TV and it kind of flickers weird, the television does. The television that the people in the show were watching flickers weird. That's what TV used to look like to dogs. Their eyes refresh at just a different rate than ours do. Ours refresh at about 50 hertz, and theirs refresh at about 75 hertz. So they could just see things that are happening quicker than we do. So the TV used to look just like a flicker to them. But now with digital TV, they can see things just as well as you and I can. So your dog can, in fact, watch and see television. We have a big screen TV up in my lab where you know, owners or other students can sit in one side of the lab, the sort of office side, and watch the dogs participating in studies on the other side of the lab, the sort of researchy side. And sometimes sibling dogs will be in there waiting too, and they'll be looking at what their sibling is doing in the other room by watching the big screen TV. It's really cute. So they can see television. Overall, dogs' vision is similar to humans, but generally kind of worse than ours in some ways. Hearing is pretty similar to us. They can hear at the same kind of low frequencies that we can, but the major difference is that they can hear at much higher pitched things than we can. So this is why a dog whistle works, right? Yeah, it's too high pitched for a human to hear, but a dog can hear it. It's still within the frequency. There are some things that can make it harder or easier for dogs to hear things. Some breeds have ears that flop over and cover their ear canals, making it harder to hear. Other dogs have perky ears that make it a little bit easier to hear. So there are some breed differences in hearing, but they seem to be more about the shape of the ear than about anything that's happening inside of it. Hearing isn't all that different. Vision is a little bit different, but not crazy different. But their sense of smell is bananas. It is outrageous, the kinds of things that they can smell. This is where they really excel and where their world is so completely different from our world, our sense of smell. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you, but don't be scared. They're just for you to go ooh and ah about because they're so crazy. Humans have about 6 million sensory receptors for smell, and dogs have a staggering 300 million. You might then think that they can smell 50 times better than we can, but you'd be wrong because they have a whole bunch of other things that we haven't even gotten to that mean that they can smell even better. They can smell about 10 to 100,000 times better than we can. So their sense of smell is really amazing. So why is that? What are those other things that help make them super sniffers? Well, the epithelium, or the tissue in the nose that's involved in olfaction or smelling, is much larger in dogs than it is in humans. It's about 30 to 35 times larger in dogs than in humans. So they just have more surface area for the scent to get in there and sort of stick to. Humans, interestingly, when we smell something, we're using the same passages, the same nasal passages that we use for breathing. So that means that when we breathe, we blow out the scent molecules that we've just sniffed in, we blow them right back out when we exhale. So if odor isn't detected right away, then it's going to be gone really soon. But dogs have this really cool cavity in their nose called the olfactory recess that holds little pockets of air inside of it. And so that allows their noses to that allows the scent molecules a longer contact time with the receptors that are going to detect odor in their noses. So while we're breathing it in and breathing it right back out, dogs are breathing it in and holding it there for longer than we do. So dogs can bring odors into that recess by sniffing, and they're even better at sniffing than we are. You'd think sniffing would be a pretty easy thing, but actually they are much better at it than we are. They can sniff about 10 times faster than we can, and that sort of high sniff rate combined with that olfactory recess really makes sure that any odor molecules hit those receptors inside their noses and get sent up to the nervous system, up to the brain of the dog. And speaking of those, bringing that up to the nervous system of the dog, humans have about 12 to 40 million olfactory neurons, or cells that are specialized in bringing scent information to the brain and processing it. But dogs have 220 million up to 2 billion olfactory neurons, so depending on the breed. So that's 20 to 50 times as many neurons involved in scent detection as we have. All of this is really hard to conceptualize. Like, what is the sensory world of the dog like if so much of their world is involved in smell? How can we even conceptualize that? So for many humans, our sensory world is dominated by vision. That's what we're kind of pretty good at. But for dogs, it's by smell. And so if you were to sort of think about, I'm going to make a taste analogy rather than a visual analogy. But a taste analogy would be like, if you were to take, a teaspoon of sugar and put that in a cup of water, you could detect that pretty easily. Maybe even in, 2 or 3 cups of water, you could tell that it was sweet with a teaspoon of water added. But dogs' sense of smell is so good that if it were taste, they could detect 1 teaspoon of water or 1 teaspoon of sugar in enough water to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. They can detect 1 rotten apple in a barrel of 2 million apples. Or my favorite, 1 pair of dirty socks in a pile of 2 million clean ones. So their sense of smell is really, really staggering and something that we really can't even conceive of. I think one thing that I like to talk about when I talk about a sense of smell is what this means for our ethical duty to our dogs. For dogs, their sense of smell is so crucial to them. I see a lot of people out walking dogs all the time who are in a big rush. Their dog stops to sniff something and they're like, come on, let's go, we're exercising. And there's nothing wrong with that, with having the occasional or a regular exercise walk. But I think we owe an ethical duty to our dogs to allow them to sniff, to allow them to use their noses and really get a sense of what's happening in the world around them using their little noses. So I like to take dogs on a sniffy walk. This is where I'm totally guided by the dog. The dog wants to stop and sniff for 10 minutes, then we stop and they sniff for 10 minutes. They are picking up all of the information that's happening in the world around them. My dogs are smelling. My favorite of their interactions with the fox was one day I was getting their leashes on to take them for a walk, and they were standing at the front door, and the fox came strolling down the street and peed on a bush in our front yard. And one of my dogs went ballistic. And so I waited a few minutes. We went outside for our walk after he was gone. And Charlie made a beeline over for that bush and he sniffed and sniffed and sniffed, and then he peed on top of the fox's pee. So he was getting all kinds of information about that fox by sniffing that spot that he had marked. In addition to these sniffy walks, you can also do other kinds of things to allow your dog to use their sense of smell in some really important and engaging ways for them. You can use snuffle mats. Well, I had one in here, but it's gone now, which are basically just things that you can hide food in, and then they have to use their nose to go around and find it. You can do scent games where you hide treats or food around your house and have your dog go find them. So allowing your dog to use his or her nose is, I think, really part of our ethical duty as dog owners. And last but not, I'm not sure how much time I've got here, but last but not least, I just want to mention here this idea that dogs are a human's best friend. And a lot of people ask me, do dogs think the same of me, right? Maybe my dog is my best friend. That's Cleo on the wall behind me. Maybe Cleo is my best friend, but am I Cleo's best friend? And so there's been a lot of research lately on this very topic that I think is very endearing, very heartwarming. So I want to end with a little bit of that. We know that dogs are attached to their owners in the same kind of way that human infants attach to their parents. So there's this very famous study called The Strange Situation, in which human parents interact with their kids and then leave the room, leave them with a stranger, and then come back to the room. They look at how the babies respond when their owner comes back. Oh, babies are happy. They might cry when their mom leaves, but they're happy to see her when she comes back. Dogs do the same thing. Dogs are going to be sad when you leave the room, but they're going to be thrilled to see you when you come back. So in the strange situation paradigm, they show attachment to their owners, much like human infants show to their parents. We also know from some very clever studies that that dogs, given a choice between greeting their human after they come home from work and they've been gone for 8 hours, or eating a bowl of food, again, after they haven't had any food for 8 hours, prefer to greet their human. The food will be there after they say hello, but they want to say hello first. So they do prefer us over food. And there's even some evidence of that from fMRI studies, where you can take scans of dog brains while they're awake and while they're making decisions, which is an amazing feat of training. And we can see that the reward systems in dogs' brains activate, they light up when dogs smell their owners, and also that they prefer, their reward systems go crazier if they're getting petted versus if they're getting a treat. So they do really seem to prefer us to food, which is another one of those facts that shock people a lot. So, oh, I'm seeing all these things in the chat. Is it Q&A time, I think?
Yes, why don't you go ahead?
Perfect. That sounds good. I am just going to scroll down here. Okay, good questions. Here we go. Oh yeah, so that's Cleo behind me. She is my almost 17-year-old Australian Shepherd who is, you can see her there with Charlie, my other dog. and she is a wild woman. The painting was done by my husband's cousin, who's an artist. Her name is Abby Bauman, Bammann. And her art studio is Jubilee Art Studio. If you're interested, if you email me later if you want me to put you in contact with her. Okay, so a question about dog intelligence and vocabulary. Oh, I love this. I get asked all the time, what's the smartest dog breed? And that question is so impossible to answer because dogs were bred for lots of different purposes. So my Australian Shepherd mix is, Border Collies and Australian Shepherds always top the list of smartest dog breeds if you Google it. What I think they're missing there is really, what do we mean when we say smart? A lot of times what we mean is most trainable. And so if you're looking at dogs that really want to work with you and be trained by you or learn new things, then sure, herding dogs are really up there because they have been bred over thousands of years, hundreds of years, I should say, to work closely with humans, to work in collaboration with humans, and to be very trainable. Other dogs are bred to be more independent. And so when I talked about my terrier being stubborn, really she was independent. She didn't need me to tell her what to do. She had her own plan about what she would do. And I was just, I was a pleasant part of her life, but I wasn't, I didn't have to tell her how to live every day, like I did my Cocker Spaniel, who just didn't really know what to do with herself. So I think dog intelligence is kind of a hard topic because what do we mean when we say intelligence? It can mean lots of different things. But one thing that I think is connected to your question here is about their vocabulary. Dogs do have a pretty impressive vocabulary. They can remember, see, now I'm not going to remember, I think it's 30 to 40 different words that they have in their vocabulary, where they pick up on the words that you're saying. My favorite example of this was when Cleo was young. She used to love to go in the car because that meant we were going to the dog park. And so I had a friend visiting and we were talking about the books that we were reading. And I said that I was reading a book by John le Carré. And Cleo picked up car out of le Carré and got really excited. So many dogs can have a pretty good vocabulary, but there are some dogs with insane vocabularies. There's a dog, Chaser, who had specific labels for over 1,200 different items, 1,200 different toys. So you can teach your dogs big vocabulary. So far, the only dogs who are doing that that kind of impressive vocabulary thing are Border Collies. But actually, there's currently an effort to try and see if who can train. There's sort of a contest about can you train your dog tons and tons of words that's happening now to see if the average dog can learn that many words, or if they need tons and tons of training and if they need to be a specific breed. So we'll have an answer to that question soon. Let's see. How do dogs detect or experience impending storms? That's a great question. There's a lot of question about this. Some people think that they're detecting the pressure changes in the air. Some people think that so they do have slightly better hearing than us at the low end of frequencies as well. So they might be able to hear thunder from farther away than we can. There are some things that we just don't know how they detect stuff, but they do. So like, we also know, for example, that they can detect somebody having a glycemic episode, like a person with diabetes having a glycemic episode behind closed doors. So the person having the episode is outside and they can detect it from inside a different room. So we know that we don't know exactly how they're doing that. and other things. There's still so many questions that we have about dogs. People have only really been studying dogs for the sake of learning more about dogs since about 2000. 1999 was the first big paper. And so we have, in some ways, more questions than answers at the moment. Which dog breeds have the best sense of smell? That is another great question. They all probably have the same basic, they're all really good at smelling things, but some breeds have some additional supports. So if you think about like a scent hound, like a bloodhound, the way that their ears dangle also helps to trap scents in close to their faces. So the dogs that kind of win out on that sense of smell tend to be hounds for the most part, scent hounds in particular. But all dogs are really good at smell, but those scent hounds probably edge them out a little bit. Let's see. Aha, okay. Another great question. If dogs have spent so many generations over thousands of years eating human food scraps, how are their stomachs so sensitive that it takes a very gradual transition to move them from one dog food to another? Yeah, I mean, that is a question. We do know that dogs, so wolves really just eat meat, and so they're pretty well adapted to that. But dogs process starchy kinds of foods as well, which wolves really don't do. And so they do have specialized adaptations to eat like humans do. So we do know that from going way back, something happened probably, 9 or 10,000 years ago to dogs' guts to allow them to eat in a more sort of human-like kind of agrarian, post-agriculture kind of way. But yeah, some dogs can have some incredibly sensitive stomachs. We're battling Cleo's stomach issues right now, as she won't eat, like we put things in front of her and she eats it for a day and then she'll never eat it again. We have like 15 different kinds of dog food in the house. So it is a good question, and one that I don't really know. I do know that they have those specialized adaptations for the more diverse diet, but I don't know why they have sometimes some pretty sensitive stomachs. How long are the reproductive cycles of most domestic dogs? Another great question. And this actually is really fascinating because wolves generally have one litter of pups a year, but dogs can have 2, sometimes 3 litters of pups per year. So their breeding cycle is a lot shorter than it is for wolves. This is part of something called domestication syndrome, where you find that dogs or any animals that have been domesticated tend to have shorter reproductive cycles, or more frequent litters, I should say. And if you look at those foxes that I was telling you about earlier, one other thing that changed was exactly that. They started to have pups twice a year instead of just once a year. So they are reproducing quicker than wolves. Let's see. Would a dog who hasn't seen his mother since he was a puppy remember her years later? I don't know. That's another great question. If I had to guess, I would guess yes, that there would be at least some recognition, potentially based on smell, but whether he would remember details about her or things that they did together or whatever, I'm not entirely sure. It's a great question. Let's see. There's oh yes, my dogs are pretty chill. There they are, snoozing. Oh, okay, so you're reading Dog is Love by Clive Wynne. Yes, I'm familiar with the author. He's awesome. So he does some really cool stuff. And he actually was the one who hosted the conference I mentioned about the people fighting about how many years ago did dogs evolve. Yeah. Let's see. If you're getting a purebred dog from a small commercial breeder or a puppy mill, how can you be assured of its long-term health? Ooh, that can be really hard. You really can't be assured of their long-term health. I would say take them to the vet and get a workup as soon as possible. A lot of puppy mills will remove puppies from their moms before they're really old enough for that to happen. And so they really don't have the social skills that they need either. So you might want to work with a trainer to get the dog socialized as quickly as you can. And I see here, can dogs sense your emotions? Yes, so there's been some really interesting work on this as well that suggests that dogs can sense when people are in distress in particular, and are pretty good at responding to it. So there's this really cute study where they actually, oh no, it was not a Clive Wynne study, but where they sort of trapped people in a box, and the dog had to get them pull a ball to get them out. And dogs would do that if people seemed to be crying, but not if they were not crying. I see here that we are about out of time. I'm going to put my contact information in here.
Ellen, before you go, there's a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if you could take a look at those.
Yeah. Were dogs domesticated in North America by Native Americans related to the North American wolves, or do they trace back genetically? Okay, to the Eurasian wolves. Great question. Actually, humans brought dogs with us across the Bering Strait. So there were not domestic dogs in the United States until we brought them across the Bering Strait, which is kind of crazy. By the time we were crossing the strait, dogs were so important to us that we brought them with us, which is really, really cool. In fact, lots of breeds diverged from those initial dogs that came across the strait with humans, but they've all died out because of colonialism. So when the Europeans came over, they brought European dogs that brought diseases that wiped out the native dogs. So there are no more native dogs around. There are dogs that kind of resemble some of those native dogs, but they are European dogs. And last one here, we adopted a Jack Russell Terrier at 2.5 years. She was not house trained. Stools are always outside, but she urinates on a pad, despite efforts to take her out at least 5 times a day. It can be hard to potty train an adult dog, but I will just mention here really quickly too that at Wesleyan, we are sort of currently in the process of thinking about starting an animal training program. And so me and Abby Kerr, who's another person in the psychology department, are both currently working to become certified applied animal behaviorists. And we both need to get a certain number of hours of working with dogs with behavior problems under our belts. So, so do shoot me an email and I'll be happy to help you if I can with your dog.
Okay.
Yeah. Perfect. Any other questions or anything I can?
That was fantastic.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Just so you know, don't forget now the contact information is in the chat, and also just so you know, I'm the first person in line to have my dog checked out. I've already asked.
Yep. We're going to work on that barking.
Yeah, so get in line. No, really, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And I think this was one of the more well-received programs that we've had in quite some time.
Great.
We really appreciate everybody out there with all the great questions, and just keep them coming. And speaking of coming back, next month we'll be asking the question, what is a liberal education and why does it matter? So join us for Georgia Nugent next month, and we'll be here back here February 11th at 12:10, same time. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Anything to add, Karl?
No, we're good. Thank you, Ellen. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Take care.